Okay, this is my constructed response project on creating and scoring essay tests. What is an essay question? An essay question is a form of a constructed response item used to assess students. It requires a response of one sentence to multiple paragraphs from a student. So the one sentence could be anything like a short answer question or a fill in the blank question, which is a form of short answer, or the multiple paragraphs can be something like an essay question off a standardized test where a student has to write a couple pages. You can usually determine on the multiple paragraphs by giving them a word limit or expressing that in the prompt. Two different types of essay questions are restricted response questions, which is usually whenever the teacher gives a specific word limit on what they would like the student to answer the question in. So, for example, in 150 words, describe the benefits of parental involvement in the school and students' education. So, normally you want to avoid one line prompts like this because they can be slightly vague, but it's obviously seeking a much shorter response from the student because it is giving a word limit of 150. Another is extended response questions, and this there's not a word limit, and usually it's a lot longer, a lot more detailed of a prompt. For example, identify the advantages of standardized testing as well as the disadvantages. Describe the difference between achievement testing and standardized testing and how you believe they have affected the education system, if at all. In this example, there's not a word limit, so that makes it an extended response question. You're obviously seeking a much longer response from the student because of the amount of questions they ask in the prompt. You have to answer the advantages and the disadvantages, describe the difference between achievement testing and standardized testing, and then you're asking the students an opinion. So they're having to answer a total of 4 questions right there. So it'd be difficult to give them a word limit regardless. Um, how to create an essay question. Whenever you're doing this, there's just a few guidelines. The first one is to convey to students a clear idea regarding the extensiveness of the response desired. This is meaning where this is kind of where you'll determine if you want a restricted response or an extended response. This is really just telling you that you need to decide for yourself before you give it to the students how you want them to respond. If you want a short answer or if you want a longer answer. Um, Normally, if you're wanting a shorter response from the student, you'll do more essay questions. And if you're wanting longer, more in-depth responses, you'll typically have less questions. Um, it's basically just about restricting how much time and words and space is used for a question for the students. A lot of teachers will um, only provide a certain amount of space on a piece of paper to do this as a way of limiting how much students actually write. Um, the second is construct items so the student's task is explicitly described. This is really just a description of assessment task, which is what the students are responding to. So, in other words, the prompt. Whenever you're doing this, you don't want to be very vague, like the first example I gave. For instance, it was only one line, so you have to be careful whenever you're doing that to make sure that it's not vague, and you need to make sure you have the details in there, more specific, like the second example I gave. The third is provide students with the approximate time to be expended on each item as well as each item's value. Whenever a student sits down, looks at a test, and there's some multiple choice, and then they have their essay questions, if there's more point value on the essay questions, you need to communicate that. That's all about what this specific guideline is about, is communicating point values or what you know is going to take longer. You need to express that with your students who are about to take your test so that they're not rushed at the end or can't answer to their full ability because they don't have the time left over because they spent too much time on other questions that shouldn't take as long. So that one is just all about communicating. The fourth one is do not employ optional items. So a lot of times on tests, there'll be multiple essay questions and 5, for example, and on the test it'll say choose 3 of the 5 essay questions to respond to. You want to avoid this because whenever students see this, they get excited because they get to choose what they know. You're not really assessing the full extent of their knowledge because they're going to only answer the things they know. So, whenever creating an essay question, you need to make sure that you decide the prompts, and that you're testing the students on the knowledge you want them to know, just not so they can pick and choose what they answer. That's only showing you a certain amount of knowledge they know. So you really need to avoid them being able to pick and choose what options they want to, what questions they want to answer. The fifth is precursively judge an item's quality by composing mentally or in writing a possible response. So this is really just all about, once you've completely finished writing your essay question, is looking at it and putting yourself in the student's shoes, um, and then try to make sure you've completed all the other guidelines first off, and then actually coming up with an answer yourself, so you in a sense know what you want out of the response, and you can try to already have a base um, scoring system for whenever you do receive their responses. Um, these are just a couple examples of essay questions. One, in today's generation, it is believed that the use of technology and cell phones have altered people being able to speak and write correctly. To what extent do you agree or disagree? This one is by saying to what extent do you agree or disagree, this is making the students choose a side. They either have to agree or they have to disagree. They can't sit there in the middle or sit on the fence and just talk about both sides. And you also need to make sure that it's something that the students have experienced. A lot of students have experienced technology, and should be something that is touched on in school too. But in this specific essay question, it gives a base point of what it should be talking about, and then asks the student's opinion. Another example is, it is said that educators have began to teach to the test. Do you think that standardized testing has affected the way teachers teach their students? What are the advantages and disadvantages of standardized testing? So this particular example would probably be more of a extended response question, because has multiple questions, is more detailed. You're probably going to get a lot longer of a response whenever you get this one. But both of these are good examples of essay questions. Whenever you're scoring an essay question, it all begins whenever you're writing it, because the fifth guideline to creating it is trying to put yourself in their shoes and creating a base response to what you think you'll receive. So that's where it all starts. But then the first one is score responses holistically and or analytically. And holistically, you're going to focus more on the response as a whole. So if you're looking at an essay question, you're judging it on organization, communicative clarity, adaptation to audience, word choice, and mechanics. You're going to focus on that all together and then give a score. If you're doing it analytically, you're going to focus on each individual one, and usually you'll use some type of a point system. So 1 being not very good, 5 being very good. You get to rate each one of them all together and then come with an average for the student's score. Analytically is normally the more beneficial one, because you can see from individual students more specific strengths and weaknesses. For example, if one student has great word choice, but they're struggling in their organization, it shows you what you need to work on with that specific student. The second one is prepare a tentative scoring key in advance of judging students' responses. Then make decisions regarding the importance of the mechanics of writing prior to scoring. Then score all responses to one item before scoring responses to the next item. So whenever you're grading your students' responses, you want to go through and, like, for example, if you're grading organization, you want to go through and grade each of them's organization first to make sure you're grading them all exactly the same. Because if you go through and go with organization and communicative clarity, adaptation to audience, word choice, and mechanics, grade all one paper that, then go to the next, it's possible that you might vary from response to response. You need to answer them all across the board and then move to the next item. And then for number 5, evaluate responses anonymously. For the most part, students are going to know, if you're just in an average classroom, that you were the one grading their exams, or their responses. But however, you can use other forms of evaluation and try to stay as vague and anonymous when giving back those responses to students, and a big part of it is grading fairly, so you wouldn't even have a question about this. This I just put on here. It is a example of the 7th grade STAR expository writing rubric, just to show a base of how to grade an essay question. On this, it shows the organization and progression on the left. And for this particular rubric, score point 1 is not very good, and score point 4 is very good. It's more like 100. Score point 1, they're struggling. For example, for organization and progression on the score point 1, there's a lot of repetition. It's weak organization of ideas. And then for 4, it's very clear. It's very logical. It's logically organized, very well controlled. The next one is development of ideas. For this one, for example, 1, it's very weak ideas. The details and examples are inappropriate, not really beneficial to the prompt. Um, and then 4, very beneficial details and ideas, very thoughtful and engaging. Um, this a lot can do with word choice and the details and examples. And then the last one is use of language and conventions. So this is a lot about, this one includes word choice too. That they're really using their vocabulary to the best of their abilities, and they're using correct spelling and correct punctuation and all that kind of stuff. So really you need to make sure that you are hitting all topics. And this is when we talked about grading all responses across the board. So you'd go through and do organization and progression for every student's essay, then go to development ideas, every student's essay, then the next of use of language and conventions, and do every single essay. So the biggest thing is being consistent and detailed all across the board when creating and scoring your essay questions.